Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Frank Wealth Insights. I'm your host, Frank Fantozzi, and today we're talking about something that should be top of mind for many business owners: how to best exit my business and to maximize the value when you're ready to sell your business. But before we dive in, just a quick note that this episode is for general educational purposes only. It's not financial, legal, or tax advice. Always check in with your own advisors before making any decisions about your business or your finances. So now that we got the legal stuff out of the way, they say when you first get into business, you should already be thinking about how to get out of your business. Now, while that might seem odd to many because you're feeling, that for the first time you're just trying to figure out how to get a paycheck and get your business off the ground, but I think metaphorically it means that, there should be a future plan for your business. The fact that you have time on your side is when you're best ready to think about how to transition your business versus waiting to the end and you're all tired out and saying, hey, I think it's time, I'm ready to tap out. We'll also touch on some important financial and emotional aspects of your process. So if you ever wondered how and why this works and how to successfully exit a business, you're in the right place. So let's just jump in. As a business owner, the items that we're going to discuss today are very relevant to your organization and especially to your family. Thinking about exit planning is really trying to exit on your terms versus those terms being dictated to you. And if there's one key concept I want everyone to walk away from today is to embrace exit planning as a business strategy. I'm sure as a successful company, you have a sales strategy, you have a hiring strategy, you have a competitive strategy compared to your competition. But there is a methodology that we're going to talk to and the thought process that goes into how to create an exit planning strategy so that you are maximizing the value, not only financial value, but purpose value, legacy value to you and your family. So this picture, you're going to recognize someone who's pretty famous. Warren Buffett is considered one of the best value investors of our time. And he always had an interesting quote: managers and investors alike must understand that accounting numbers are just the beginning and not the end. And what he's trying to get at is that one of the terms we'll use throughout this conversation today is about valuation. I need to get a business value so I understand what the value of my business. And there's a lot that goes into creating that, and we'll talk a little bit later. But the key thing I want you to understand about a valuation is the number is the tip of the iceberg. So you've heard the analogy, what you see above the water is just the iceberg, and you have this big mass, below. Well, there's a lot of truth in that. The key thing with a valuation, it's a report card. Because in your mind, you have a certain value that you think you want your business to be worth. And then when the valuation expert comes in, they're going to say, well, your value is X and you were hoping it would be Y. Well, he or she are basing the valuation on your competition. And your competition is dictating what the value is in the marketplace and what a private equity company or multiple might be used to value that business in the marketplace. And so if you think about the valuation and haven't done on a regular basis, it's telling you what you're good at, what you're so-so at, and what you're not good at. And it gives you a chance to rectify and make changes in the business to improve the value of your company. So I think that's the important thing to gather from the quote that Warren Buffett has shared with us, is to understand that there's more than meets the eye. It's not just a number. There's a lot more to it. So before we go really deep, I want to at least talk about what they call the 5 Ds. So hopefully most of you have your estate planning documents in order. Why? If something happens to you, you want to make sure your spouse, your family are all taken care of, your assets are moving. We always describe estate planning as taking what you have, giving it to who you want, when you want, with any conditions. So what are you doing for the estate planning for your business? Okay, what happens if there's a death of the business owner? And we'll just assume for now there's two owners. All right, so you have a death of an owner. So what's going to happen? Unfortunately, God forbid, because we all have an expiration date. We just don't know when that expiration date is. So we have an untimely death. I don't think there's ever a timely death, but what happens to the business? What happens to your partner? What happens to the vendors? What happens to your family? How does this all get handled? The same thing happens when there's a disability. You're in a skiing accident and, it's something that you can return from, but you can't return for 18 months. Well, what's going to happen? And what happens if that disability becomes permanent and you can't really return to your former self and be active in the business? What happens to your shares? Who's going to fill that void? Because normally most owners, sit in an important chair within the organization. Listen, we don't like to talk about divorce, but the statistics back it up. Half of all marriages end in a divorce. Well, I'm sure your partner doesn't want to become partners with your spouse. So what are the plans for handling things when there is a divorce? Was there a prenup put in place? Is there going to be an automatic buyout of the spouse if half the assets have to go to her? Well, let's face it, for many business owners, the business is probably the most substantial asset on the business, especially if it's a very successful one. We talk about partners. You start out, we're all buds, we're chums, we're working hard, and we never think we're going to have a disagreement. And it doesn't even have to be a disagreement. But if there is a disagreement and I want out, how is the business going to be valued? How are you going to buy me out? I don't want to be partners with you anymore. But like I said, it doesn't even have to be a disagreement. We both planned on working until we're 60 and getting out, and now I'm 50 and I just don't want to do it anymore. Maybe the business is successful enough and I just want the money and I want to run and do other things, or I'm just burnt out. In either case, there needs to be a format for that exiting partner. And listen, what did we just go through in 2020? How many businesses went out of business because of, COVID and all the restrictions and businesses being shut down and not returning to their former self? These are what they call the 5 Ds. And so one of the things that's really, really important is that, and a lot of this can be handled through an agreement called a buy-sell arrangement, where the financial terms are discussed, where a formula is usually used to create a valuation, or you can agree to have someone do a valuation at any one of these events and just agree to use that number. But there's a mechanism in place. It takes the emotion out. It takes out the disagreement. It saves a ton of legal, yes, there's some upfront legal costs, but it's an ounce of prevention is much better than a pound of cure. So these are things that we talk about right out of the gate to deal with the things that we don't foresee. These are the things that no one wants to plan on. No one wants to plan on a death or a disability or divorce, or, hey, we're best friends now, we're never going to argue, or, there's the next financial, cascade that happens around the world or in the United States. So these are things that we need to get off the plate right away, because if we can't deal with these 5 Ds right away, then the other issues are going to be more challenging. How serious is this? Well, the statistics on individuals who don't have their estate planning documents is significantly high. It's even higher when they do studies to talk about business owners and the readiness of business owners to deal with any of these important issues. Based on the studies that are out there, 2/3 do not even know their exit options. In other words, what options do I have if I want to get out of my business? 78% don't have a transition team, 83% have no written transition plan, and almost 50% don't have a plan at all. And those 5 Ds I talked about, 40% don't even have a buy-sell arrangement in place, or if it's a solo practitioner, any plan in place to cover the 5 Ds. So these are critical because in the United States, there's over 25 million small businesses, okay? And those businesses can range from, a mom and pop shop to 50 employees to 100 employees and even 500 employees. The key thing here is that there are a lot more businesses than I think people realize. If you look at the New York Stock Exchange, for example, there's approximately 2,600 listed domestic international companies. And if you go to the NASDAQ, there's approximately 3,800 companies. So the number of business owners that are out there that don't have these plans in place is great. And we need to figure out how to help these business owners put things in place so that their most important asset is protected. And, for those successful business owners, it isn't a surprise that their business is going to be the most important asset on their balance sheet. The only challenge is it usually provides for ongoing living through your salary and distributions, but the value of that business is still illiquid and locked up. And at some point, you're going to want to unlock that value and use it in your financial planning. What are my options? Okay, we talked about the 5 Ds and the true need to do planning, but again, a lot of people haven't given thought. And what you don't want to have, and I hear this a lot, it's actually kind of funny, when I ask some of the business owner clients, because it's on our reviews, when we meet with a business owner and they don't have an articulated plan, we ask them, okay, any thoughts about when we can talk about putting a plan in place? I'm just going to die with my boots on. Okay, well, that is a plan, and we have no problem having you pass away with your boots on, but at some point, if you die with your boots on, there still needs to be steps in place. Okay, who's going to take over the business? Who's going to sell the business? Does your spouse want to take over the business? Highly unlikely, right? So these are things that even if you plan on dying with your boots on, you need to think about, what are my options out there and which option best fits my business. And what I mean by that is, over time, you develop vendor relationships, you develop friendships with your team, you develop friendships with your management group. Your business becomes part of your alter ego because the view, and when people see you, they also look at your business. Oh, that's Steve. He owns Ajax Company, right? So it's really important. There's a psychology that's tied into not only the value of the business, but the psychology of the fact that the business is important to you as something that's woven into your personality and who you are. But one of the things we really need to think about is, what is the right transition path for you? Are your kids working in the business? Are we planning on eventually transitioning the business to the kids? Well, maybe you have kids, and that's great. What happens if the kids don't want the business? Or you don't have any kids in the business? Is the management team, or they call an MBO, management buyout, something that you're wanting to consider? Are you big enough that you will attract private equity, and is private equity a way to do that? They can come in and buy out part of the business, so you take some of the winnings off the table. There's a number of methods that we can use, but waiting too late could really hurt you financially. A lot of business owners wait till the peak value of the business because they wait too long to sell the business. And what I mean by that is, they wait till they get tired. When you're operating at full go and you're putting everything into the business and you're growing the business, you'll reach a peak value. But if you start to wait until you're slowing down, well, if you're slowing down and you're a key component to the business, is the business going to slow down? And if the business slows down, you're eventually going to hurt the value. So looking at timing is going to be very important. So a couple things. I think probably one of the trickier parts, it's always easy to sell to an external buyer because you're looking at trying to maximize your value. I do think it gets challenging when you have employees that you want to reward and they're going to feel that they have what I call sweat equity in the business, even though you probably paid them a very fair value to their work. But it gets trickier when you have children in the business because you want to maximize value. The value is important to your financial success, but you're also stating, how am I going to take care of my kids? So that gets about trickier, and we're not going to be able to have time today to dive that deep, but it's something that we work with our closely held business owners, to really figure out how to transition the business to family if it makes sense. Because just because they're family doesn't mean they're entitled to the business, doesn't mean they have the skill sets and capability to run the business. Maybe at some point, and then you build an infrastructure to groom them, whether you have a mentorship or a board that you utilize to help groom them into roles. We often advise our clients, never hire your kids right out of college into your business. Have them go work some other places, learn what other companies are doing, because then they're going to have appreciation to what you built. It's really hard, especially for the first gen, to understand, the owners, the founders of the firm, to try to take that institutional knowledge and to take all the things that they've gone through, the pains and the gains to get the business to where it's at, to now it's a going concern. It's like a rocket ship. You ever wonder why the space shuttle's pretty small compared to these big booster rockets? Because to get out of the Earth's gravity, you need all this force to generate this rocket into space, then to propel it into space. Well, it's like a business. It's all that inertia to get that business off the ground is very difficult. And that the first gen that founded the firm knows what it was like to go without paychecks, to be underpaid, to deal with all the stresses, and figure out how to carve a niche in a competitive market space. I mean, you have to keep in mind, it's a closed system. There's only so many potential customers out there. And when you come in and try to compete with someone else, you're a threat. You're taking business away from them, right? It's not like, maybe if you're in a city that's just growing like crazy, you got new people coming in, there's abundance of wealth to share clients. But if you're in a city that has pretty stagnant growth, it's kind of keeping the head count about the same, you're taking clients from other people. So these are things that I think the second gen and the third gen have challenges with. And one of the things we want to work with when you're thinking about doing an internal family transition is to make sure, one, they are truly prepared to take on the business, and two, that financially you're going to receive what you feel you need to receive to live the life that you use that business to help create, that you can sustain it in a manner that you want. So let's talk briefly, about the 5 stages of business value maturity. Let's face it, when you first start, you're just trying to get out of the gate, but you want to establish really an initial value in your business, and then figure out, by conducting annual business valuations and doing check-ins and making sure you're doing the right things to grow the business, that you have a starting point, a benchmark, and then you're going to know year over year, are you growing the business value because you're making the right decisions along the way. We talked about earlier about protecting a business. That's the next stage. So that's all your property and casualty insurances, any of the things that you can do to de-risk the business, including the 5 Ds that we talked about. Those all have to be put in place. Then you have to figure out, how do I build the business? And what I mean by build the business, build the value of the business. And you'll learn that a key term that, if you don't know it already, is EBITDA, earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. This is at the heart of valuation, because it doesn't matter how much value the business, you paid for the business. What matters is someone who's going to buy the business is what kind of growth and income is going to come off this business. And so it's very common to look at a business valuation based on its true net cash flow. And so working on things that can help improve that EBITDA number is going to be critical to getting a value that at some point, which is stage 4, you're going to harvest it. So harvesting is, you've built the business, you got it to a point where it's at a value that you want, you have a succession plan in place, whether it's the family, management, or a third party, and now you're going to harvest it. In other words, you're going to take a illiquid asset that's produced income, but you're going to convert the whole thing to money. And that money, that liquid cash, you're going to take, and then that's going to be something that you're going to manage. You're transitioning from a business value, say, of $25 million, and now you have $25 million in cash that you're going to use to do the things that were important to you. It's one of the reasons why you started the business, most likely to create a certain level of financial freedom and financial independence. So you heard me say earlier in the beginning that I asked everyone to look at exit planning as a business strategy. And this slide really talks about the process that you should go through on a regular basis. Ideal annually, but I think every couple years you need to make sure that you're rechecking the value of the business, that you're looking for strengths, weaknesses, making adjustments. So this takes you through the process. So the discovery column, we'll call the discovery gate, you conduct an annual business valuation because you want to see, has the business value improved year over year? You're also going to assess your personal goals because your investment asset, your business, appears on your balance sheet. And again, you're going to look for strengths, weaknesses, and adjustments. So think about it as green, yellow, red. Green, everything's good. Keep doing the same thing. Yellow, we need to tweak things. It's not optimized. We need to go back and work it. And red definitely needs some actions. So now you go and move that and create a prioritized action plan. Because ideally, you'd like to be able to fix everything, but you probably can't. There's not enough time. You still have a business to run. So it's important that you prioritize these issues and figure out, all right, let's fix them in the order of importance. And one way I look at it is, which one's going to have the biggest bang for the buck? And what I mean by buck is your time and money. So now you create this action plan, and then you put it into place in regards to making these business improvements, which include mitigating risk, and you're looking at making adjustments to your personal and financial planning, and you move this thing forward. The question you always have to ask yourself, though, is, do you want to continue to grow the business, or is it time to exit? And we'll talk about why you obviously want to stay, engaged in the business, continue to grow, because maybe it's not at a value that you need to help you move on to the next stage of life. But you still have to ask the question, because I had a client who sold his business probably about 7 or 8 years before he felt he wanted to sell it. Why? There was consolidation in the business. Private equity was coming in and buying up a lot of the similar businesses, and they basically gave them the Godfather offer. And I shared with my client, I said, listen, you could stay engaged and work another 7, 8 years, and you may not realize the value that you can get today. So if you still want to work, collect a paycheck, right, and all that, but take the money. You take the Godfather offer. So you never know when someone's willing to come in and give you that Godfather offer. It makes it easier, though, when you know the numbers. When you're going through this exercise and you receive that Godfather offer, and a lot of businesses are especially with private equity and all that, a lot of businesses are successful in certain industries. I know, like in our own industry, in the financial services industry, there's a lot of PE companies. I probably get an email or a call a day regarding, hey, are you considering about partnering up, which is code for, do you want to sell your business? So depending on the industry, because they all cycle, you might get a Godfather offer, and you don't know when to take it unless you go through this exercise and figure out what your priorities are, what your number is, and how it's going to impact your family. One of the things that go into valuing a business is PE companies are looking for certain things, right? To get appropriate cash flow, to get appropriate EBITDA, there are things that are characteristics of well-run businesses. So you think about the book that Michael Gerber wrote. It's called E-Myth. So the E-Myth approach was, how do you take the owner and make that owner or owners the least important person in the organization? Now, people say, well, wait a minute, the owner's got all this knowledge, they're important. We're not saying that the owner is not going to be important. What we're trying to say is everything has to go through the owner. First of all, you create a bottleneck, but everything's dependent on the owner. So think about it. I'm going to go buy your business, and everything runs through you. And now you're gone. I mean, I might have you stay on a year to help me transition, but once you're gone, the value of the business is most likely going with you. However, the things that we're going to talk about next, if you're handling this correctly, and really, yes, you're important to the business, but guess what? You have a great team, great systems, you have all these things in place. We don't need you. The company can move on without you. And I think that's what's really, really important. And so part of your role as an owner at some point is, one, letting go of your ego, two, getting into a mode of mentoring and growing people. And the things that we're going to talk about in a second, there's a book, and there's a couple books out there like Gazelles, Scaling Up by Vern Harnish, Mastering the Rockefeller Habits, another book called EOS Traction, which is by Gino Wickman. These are all entrepreneurial operating systems, and what they're trying to do is help you decentralize the owner and make the company run independently, by the team. And that's when you start to create scale, you start to create value, and someone is going to be willing to pay for. So I'm going to go through some of the key items that we need to talk about in decentralizing the business owner. as a business owner, if I'm looking to buy your business, I'm looking to see, what systems in place, what people are in place. Because if you're going to be exiting, I need to make sure that, the value of the business doesn't go with you out the door. Then I'm really left with nothing. And so the first thing I'm looking at is how engaged does this owner have to be? Can the owner, take a month off and the company's going to rock and roll without he or she, or the owner's got to be there 24/7. So the first thing we try to look at is, the level of ownership engagement and how critical are they to every aspect of the business. The second item is we look at structural capital. And structure, think of infrastructure. Your intellectual property, your secret sauce. What are your standard operating procedures? How do you do things? Like, how do you hire people? There's a process for hiring people. What's your marketing process? How is your employee evaluation process? Do you have systems in place? Do you have trademark materials or copyrights, things like that? If you have those in place, that makes me feel good, because that I know that I'm buying something that has a system and that everyone knows how to follow the system, and it's not going to walk out the door when the owner leaves. The other is customer capital. Think about it. If I have my business tied to only, most of my revenue tied to a couple key accounts, and that key account leaves for any reason, it could leave because there's a change of ownership. Well, the owner of the customer and the former owner were best buddies. Now that the owner left, this person is going to look and shop the business around. Well, that doesn't make me feel good, right? So, or do I have a client base that's very diverse, so that if a few clients leave, which is normal, I mean, one of the things you look at when you buy a business is retention ratio of your clientele. And if you still maintain high retention after you sell the business, that tells me that you have systems in place, you have a good relationship with the vendors or the clients, and they're not turning because the owner is leaving. So those are the first three that we're going to talk about, and then we're going to move on and talk about some of the other key items that we look at while we decentralize the owner. The next is social capital. Again, is the owner the brand, right? If the company's called Ajax, and it's not named after the owner, but they don't think about Ajax, they think of, Joe Smith every time they think of Ajax. Well, then the brand is really tied to the owner, and it's not tied to the company. So is there a culture in place where it's driven by core values? And what I mean by core values, they're not just words you put up on a wall or you have on your website. Good core values, you should be hiring, firing, rewarding, and promoting your team members based on the core values. So is there a process in place? Is there a culture that when you walk through the office, everyone has that same vibe? Not only do they know their core values, they speak, talk, and act like they're part of the same company. That's social capital. When you see an owner acting one way and everyone else acting another way, you don't have culture that's in sync. You have basically two different cultures, the owner and the team, and that's not healthy. The last is human capital. Human capital is really important because, again, do you have an executive leadership team that's empowered to make decisions, or does everything have to go through the owner? Yes, the owner's probably got to be involved on some key items. I mean, that's why they're the owner, and they have probably the most at risk. But is there delegation? Can the executive team hire people without having to consult with the owner, as long as it's meeting budget? Are people getting trained? Are they being elevated? Is there promotion? There's all these things have to go into human capital, because in many businesses, human capital is what drives the business, and without good people, you're not going to build value. We're looking at finding ways to build value, and you build value through the items that we've just discussed. So now we talk about ultimately, the business value, right? And the business value, if it's tied to the owner's just going to think that they have a number in mind. Where if we deal with the items we talked about regarding social capital, human capital, all these items that we talked about, The company has a manageable level of risk that then becomes predictable and scalable. Someone who buys it knows that they have a foundation that they can then build upon, and then they're willing to pay for that. And ultimately, it impacts the price that someone's willing to pay. Because the more risk I take in having to buy your business because I don't believe it has all these intangibles in place, I'm going to pay less. I mean, think about it. The more risk I take, it's less value. If I'm buying a more certain business, I'm willing to pay more because the money that I'm expecting from the business is going to happen. So those are things that we're looking for. And the next slide talks about this. We talk about those 4 C's: human capital, customer capital, structure capital, and social capital. That's the intangible. That's the secret sauce. And that's what someone's willing to pay a multiple of. And a multiple is a number that the private equity markets, the capital markets, are willing to pay based on the cash flow. In other words, if you have $1 million of cash flow, am I willing to pay one times, 2 times, 3 times, 7 times the value of that of that? And a lot of that's driven on the 4 C's. Your financial statements, yes, having strong financial statements helps, but that's not the secret sauce. It's always the intangibles that are going to drive the value and are going to be the critical things that any buyer is going to look at. So as we move on, the key thing I want to focus on next, and this slide really brings it all together. And I know this time, our podcast is a little different. We're using some backdrops, but I think, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And while I'm trying to help illustrate these key concepts through my conversation with you, having these visuals, I think, will help, put everything in place in a much easier format. So the key metrics here that we're going to look at are 3 of them. And they all sync together, and you'll see as we walk through this. We talked about earlier that your business is a key asset on your financial statement, right? And so if you're working with your financial advisor and you're sitting there saying, all right, when should I sell? When can I retire? When can I start doing all these other things? And I don't even like to use the word retire. It's not a good word. Most of your business owners never retire. They just want to allocate their time differently. So instead of putting in, 40 hours, 50 hours at the office and working on the business, they might have other passion projects. They might want to give back to society. There's all kinds of things that you can do. We're all equal in the fact that God only gave us 24 hours in a day. It's how you decide to allocate your time. So we go through your financial plan, Mr. Business Owner, and your net, your plan says you need $25 million to do all these things that you want to do in life. Well, you have $5 million in non-business assets. So that means your business has to come up with $20 million to make things happen. In other words, fill the gap. So if we don't know what your business is worth, you might have what they call a wealth gap. In other words, if your business only comes in this situation at $15 million, and you have $5 million of already investable assets that you've invested throughout the years, you're $5 million short. So you have a wealth gap. So one of the things we have to figure out is how do we close that wealth gap? Either we have to change our lifestyle, or we have to figure out a way to make the business grow, right? And when we start allocating our time differently, we all have these what I call go-go years as we get up in age. Eventually, we end up going into these slow-go years, and then we go into the no-go years, which hopefully are a very small part of our lifeline. But the key thing here is EBITDA. We talked about earlier how EBITDA is going to drive your value and how that number impacts, from a valuation standpoint, how well your company is really operating against your competition. So EBITDA, and you're going to say, well, how do I know how my EBITDA looks? Well, your valuation is going to tell you this because the valuation expert is going to compare your company to other companies, right? So is your EBITDA best in class? Is your profitability best in class compared to your competition? So in this example, we're going to compare 2 companies. Your business has 10 million in sales, and best in class has 10 million in sales. So you guys are, you're kind of even. But here's the difference. Your EBITDA is only 2 million. Their EBITDA is 3 million. Well, think about that. That gets into this last step, which is called the value gap, because when we look at the industry, if your EBITDA is best in class, I'm willing to pay more money for it, right? Anyone's willing to pay more for a better product. And so these are just made up numbers, but I think it illustrates the point. We're in the same industry. We have 10 million in sales. All of a sudden we get a valuation done. My EBITDA is 2 million. My best in class competitors at 3 million. Well, the capital market's only willing to give me 5 million, right? So the capital markets are only going to give me what they call a 5 turn or 5 times my EBITDA. That puts the value of my company at 10 million. 2 million in EBITDA times a 5 multiple puts me at 10 million. Well, using my case above, I'm way short. I'm even shorter now. I need a total net worth of 25 million. I have $10 million valuation when I sell my business. I have 5 million in investable assets. I'm only at 15 million. But if I'm a best in class and my EBITDA is 3 million, I'm going to receive from the capital markets what they call a 7 turn or 7 times. That puts my value of my business at 21 million. So just by earning a higher EBITDA and being more best in class, I get a much higher value. So what happens is we started out with where I was short on the wealth gap, which created a profit gap because my EBITDA was below best in class, which then created a value gap because I'm not getting the value I need from my business. So going back to the beginning where I shared that this is a business strategy, it's not waiting till the end to sell your business. You have to ask yourself, if the sooner you know all this, do you have time then to make all the changes necessary to move your company to a best in class so that in this example, you go from a 2 million EBITDA to a $3 million EBITDA, and then the capital markets are going to reward you with a 7 times multiple versus a 5 times multiple. And that's why we strongly suggest to everyone, when you go through this practice on a regular basis, you're not going to be surprised when you get to a point about thinking about selling or getting the Godfather offer, that you can make decisions that are informed. You don't want to do this, 2 years before you're thinking about selling a business, because you have little runway to make the changes, to correct things, to move your business from a solid, good business to a best-in-class business. So these 3 gaps, the wealth gap comes from your financial plan. The profit gap comes from what you're going to receive in the marketplace based on how your EBITDA is. And then the last is the value gap, because that's what someone's willing to pay your company. So that's the key, a big key takeaway, and the reason why we need to look at this as a business strategy. Exit planning is a business strategy. It's not something that you wake up one morning and say, you know what, I don't have any more gas in the tank, I'm ready to sell. At that time, you're going to have to take what anyone's really going to give you, unless you're going to sit there and sign on for another 5-10 years and try to fix things. And let's face it, you might have the energy at age 40 and 50. If you're 60 and 65, are you going to want to sign on to reinvest that much more effort into your company to move it to a point of value that's going to meet your financial plan? I mean, everyone's individual, but I know as we get older, the ability to affect change becomes harder and harder as we age. So, in looking at this from a system process, there are people out there, and it doesn't have to be someone who's a CEPA certified advisor, which is a certified exit planning advisor, which I am and our firm has done work in. There are others on a national basis that will help you understand this process and put the meat on the bones, because it does require effort and time. It's not something that it's a weekend project. It's an ongoing project. But there are your CPAs and attorneys that will help you work through this process. And again, it's a team effort. If you think about it, and depending on the complexity of your family enterprise, you should have a lawyer, you should have an accountant, you have your property casualty person, you have your wealth advisor. But a couple things that might be important that you need to consider. Do you have a board of advisors, or if your business is big enough, a board of directors that are holding you, the business owner, accountable? Do you have very complex family dynamics because you have family in the business? So you need really, and I say this seriously but tongue in cheek, a family therapist that works with the dynamics here, because it's very difficult at times when the more and more family are involved. Everyone has a different view on their level of importance and engagement. There can only be usually one president, right? Maybe a couple vice presidents, one CFO. So, if you have a lot of family in your business, and I know companies that have multiple generations and 20, 30 people in the business, not everyone, as you move up the food chain, can have some of those key positions. So how do you deal with those dynamics? So it's not uncommon to have, a family therapist or a facilitator to deal with the value dynamics. We talked about having a valuation expert, and if you're, that's going to be key to this process as well. If your business is large enough, say it's a $500 million or $1 billion valued business, most likely the complexity in your personal life is going to require to have a family office executive possibly to help you deal with all the complexity of wealth management outside of the business. And you might have a coach, a family enterprise advisor. So these are the possible team members that can be involved. I always use Tom Brady as an example because a lot of people say, well, hey, I'm successful, I'm making money, why do I need all these people? Well, Tom Brady had he had a quarterback coach, he had a mental health coach, he had a nutritionist coach. Okay, this is Tom Brady, who's considered the GOAT of all time of all quarterbacks. So if he's at the top of the game and he's winning Super Bowl after Super Bowl, but he's still investing, for these consultants to help him be at the top of his game, why should you treat yourself any differently? So, good advice is worth paying for, especially if it helps move the needle. And these are things that I think you need to consider when you look at treating exit planning or continuity planning as a business strategy. So in conclusion, the call of action should be, first of all, if you have questions and you want a copy of the slides or any information that we could provide you, please reach out to us. Please call us. Our phone number is 440-740-0130, or you can send us a message on returnonlifewealth.com. But the key takeaway, I said it in the beginning, is to treat exit planning as a key business strategy. Once you embrace it that way and you treat it like you treat your hiring process, your sales process, it is a process that you need to review and do on a dedicated frequency. It is a way to move the needle. And this is how you not only protect yourself, because one of the things you'll find out going through this process is your business environment is not in a standard state. It's evolving. You don't want to be the next Blockbuster Video, which was making all kinds of money. Every street corner had a Blockbuster Video, and within 2 years, Netflix came in and took them out. And what was funny is Blockbuster had an opportunity to buy Netflix and turned them down. They didn't want to buy Netflix. So who's laughing to the bank at this point? So there's always these threats that are always going to challenge your business. So part of exit planning, and when you go through this annual review or every 2 years or 3 years on this cycle, you're going to be reviewing the threats of your business. And I think that's going to be something that will be a benefit to keep your business viable and healthy. So please, again, treat this as a key business strategy, embrace it, and make it part of your normal business activity on working on your business. So please don't forget to subscribe to Frank Wealth Insights. If you want us to be one of your favorite podcasts, please recommend us to other business owners who you feel could benefit from our insights. And to all of you who are listening today, thank you. Until next time, here's to your health, happiness, and living a life well lived. Take care.